If you stripped Gradius from its historical context and presented its ideas of player progression and punishment in a modern game design context, these ideas wouldn't appear old-fashioned, they would appear radical and subversive. And that's because Gradius does have a very modern gameplay loop or compulsion loop where you kill the enemies drop the power-up items, your reward, you collect your reward, you cash in your reward for more upgrades and firepower, which you then use to kill more enemies, to drop more items. It has that self-feeding, snowballing nature that modern critics love so much and Vampire Survivors won awards for. And so on the surface, as a modern player, when you're coming into Gradius, you're feeling like, hey, this is awesome. This is going super well. This is the exact type of system I want to see. I'm getting so powerful. I've got all these options. I've got the laser, feel empowered, and I'm in the flow state. Meanwhile, as you're happily going through the progression loop, Gradius is quietly plotting against you
through the dynamic rank.
And it's like boiling a frog. You don't really notice it at first, but the game is countering you systematically. What ends up happening is everything's fantastic, and then you're dead. And not only are you dead, you are ripped from this world, you are thrown on the ground, you are stomped on, and all of your progress is wiped away. If you're lucky and you forgot to cash in one of your power-up items, you can at least have a baby little speed upgrade. But outside of that, everything you've been doing is gone. And depending on where this occurs, it can be completely devastating. And that's what's so subversive about the Gradius system, where it creates the feeling of flow and progression and then crushes you for engaging in it. It's actually really funny in terms of modern design sensibilities because it seems like the game is just trolling you, even though it isn't. And so why? Why is Gradius doing this? Is it to take your quarters like the Forbes review says? And for context, the Forbes review was positive, but you know this accusation really annoys me. And the answer is no. Gradius isn't trying to be tricky and cheap and take your money in an unfair way. Instead, what it's doing is it's protecting itself. It's protecting its own design by giving the power-up system a natural counter incentive. I think a good analogy to think of is in a racing game, what you want is acceleration. What you want is speed. But acceleration and speed have a cost. They have a counter incentive, traction and control. And so if you're playing Gran Turismo and you're flying down the track full acceleration and you miss your turn and slam into a wall, is that Gran Turismo being cheap? Or is Gran Turismo just introducing a more complex counter incentive system to the way the car controls and drives? That's the way rank is calibrated and works in arcade games. And I've been thinking a lot lately about why did this style of counter incentive fade away? Why don't we have rank dynamic difficulty systems anymore? It makes so much sense in a game design framework. And that's why I say there's something subversive about this, because it feels like it's a response that needs to come, not a response that was from the past. It's like this aspect in history of game design just has been lost. And I think it goes back to the context and the economic incentive of home console games versus arcade games. And so starting with arcade games, arcades had a specific problem that modern console games don't, which is they had to deal with the most highly skilled players in an economic sense. Because highly skilled players can screw around with the economics of your arcade game in a way that they cannot with your home console game. And the reason why is because they had two distinct powers. First off, in your actual arcade, if G3 Fleeko shows up and sits down at your Gradius cabinet, he is going to get 3 hours of gameplay on that Gradius cabinet for 1 credit. That is an economic problem. And so the games had to start defending themselves against the highest skill players. And that's why rank systems start to exist, and why, if you look at the evolutionary history of arcade games, they get more aggressive and difficult as they go on. Look here with Gradius. But on top of that, it's not just that they block off the coin turnover rate, they are also the repeat customers. So there's this hilarious, weird dual nature relationship of the expert players with the arcade machines economically, where on one hand, they're a great threat because they constantly slow down your coin turnover. But on the other hand, they are your most valuable customers because they're the people who are going to keep coming back, keep putting in quarters, keep playing your games. And so that is why arcade games specifically had to develop a lot of these very sophisticated systems to deal with legacy skill. And when it came to designing the games, designing the balance of the games, legacy skill was a heavy consideration. It was a big factor even early on. But in a home console context, sure, I can destroy Ninja Gaiden Ragebound in 3 hours, but that doesn't affect anyone. And so since the economic model of the home console is more isolated and it's just down to the personal relationship between the player and the game, that competitive relationship that arcade machines had with their players is removed. And instead, I think you see more of a quietly cooperative relationship between home console games and home console players. The developers want to delay your gratification and increase the retention, but they don't need to seriously combat you in the same way that an arcade machine does. And so going back to the way this influences gameplay loops and punishment, the strict punishment of Gradius is not about protecting your psyche, like we see with flow state, psychological style of game design now. Gradius doesn't give a shit about your psyche. What Gradius is trying to protect is its design and its longevity. And that's why the power-up system and the deaths of Gradius are anti-gameplay loop design, is because after you experience such a sharp punishment and you look at the rank and you look at the power-ups, you don't have that instant dopamine flow state relationship with them anymore. Now you have a much more complex two-sided relationship with the gameplay loop, where on one hand, you need the power, but on the other hand, you're afraid of the rank. And it creates this beautiful ambiguity where you have to constantly question, is it worth it? And as the game goes on, the answer becomes yes. Definitely, you need these power-ups, especially in the later parts of the game. Just like in Gran Turismo, eventually you do have to decide to go fast. That is how it is played, but you also need to keep an eye on your speedometer. You understand that there is a price to the speed. Where with a lot of modern games, if you just get yourself powered up, that is basically the end of the game. I call this RPG breakaway. Obviously, Vampire Survivors, the entire game, is the progression system. But even outside of that, most modern action games now, because they have progression elements to them, you can just overpower the rest of the game through pure stats. Whereas with Gradius, the end of the progression system isn't the end of the game, it's the beginning. So now that we understand the risk and reward of the progression system, the first big hurdle we're going to have to deal with in terms of systematic difficulty are the checkpoints. If the power-up bar is the signature mechanic of Gradius, then these checkpoints are the signature punishment, because they are distinct and brutal. But what's interesting is that historically, the reason for these checkpoints, and this is confirmed by the developers, is because of a hardware limitation. Going back to the Ninja Gaiden review from last time, you can see this pattern over and over again. A lot of signature ideas and mechanics in game design often go back to the relationship with their hardware. But in terms of artistic decision making, it's important to remember that even though the concept originates from a hardware limitation, the developers ended up recognizing that they liked this gameplay dynamic, and then they carried it forward through the rest of the series, even outside of hardware limitations being a concern anymore. anymore. I think that's just as valid as coming up with the idea in a design document or something, especially because of its relationship with the power-up bar, where without the checkpoint recovery system, I don't think the power-up bar really has that much meaning, because you'll notice if you're playing it without taking hits and without having to recover, the power-up bar doesn't have that much purpose, because there is kind of usually an optimal route you're going to go. You're going to get a certain amount of speed ups. You're going to try to get all the options. And then from there, it's going to be use your laser and just keep your shields refreshed. That's pretty much what you do 90% of the time. There might be a few scenarios here and there where you change to a double or something. But for the most part, there is an ideal power-up layout that you're going to be aiming for and trying to maintain throughout the run. But the place where having the multiple selection of different power-up options and choosing when to use certain powers, that comes into play much more meaningfully during checkpoint recovery. And so it seems like without the checkpoint recovery process, the power-up bar itself is not really that important. And I do think it is interesting that when they shifted over to Salamander, where they had the power-ups be specific items rather than a universal fuel, they also don't use the checkpoint system. And I think that makes sense, because the power-up bar and checkpoint together, that is what makes Gradius happen. That lends to the ambiguity of the routing, and I think it works really well, because I did sit down and think in a lot of the recovery sections, all right, what would be the best power-up route here? What am I kind of aiming for? And a cool example of the depth of the checkpoint recovery system is in the Gamist magazine back in the day. They had hand-drawn guides on how to get through certain checkpoint recoveries, which are really cool to look at. And it just shows the dedication and strategy this checkpoint system managed to create. And one of the best elements of the power-up system that I don't think gets recognized that much is the fact that the power-up items are contained in the enemies, because it allows the developer to tie the carrot of getting a power-up to very specific instances of risk and reward. And you'll definitely feel this in the later stages, especially if you're trying to recover. It emphasizes the level design by allowing the developer to control the flow of resources. It seems simple, but I think it works really well. And I like the idea that everything in the game is so contextual to the level design. For example, the bomb. Gradius has a bomb, but it's a contextual item. It's not something you carry in your inventory. It's something that you have to spawn on the screen in a very specific instance. That works so well in terms of protecting the game's level design, because what would happen, especially in Gradius 2, let me tell you, is if I could carry that bomb, that 1cc would have been a lot more simple, because I would have just carried the bomb to the final screen, and then the part where it gets really dicey and I need to very carefully maneuver around things, just fire off the bomb, done. So anyway, the checkpoints plus the power-up items, I really like this system. And so as much as I'm vibing with the concepts of the power-up bar and the checkpoints, where do they run into a problem? Of course, the infamous Gradius syndrome. And quickly, I'll explain what Gradius syndrome is. Gradius syndrome is the meta problem of if you're playing run after run, going for the 1cc, it's more time efficient to just continue to try to play for a no miss and never have to deal with the checkpoint system, rather than going through and learning every single checkpoint and every single recovery. That is Gradius syndrome. Now, the infamous Gradius syndrome is something that I've definitely criticized before, but I think I have a better understanding of what's going on here thanks to the port. Because one thing that the port does is it adds the gadget of being able to monitor rank. This is a very big deal. It seems like one of those cute little extras, like, oh, little gadget. No, rank monitoring, I think, should have been in the game all along. This is one of my biggest critiques of this era of arcade games. Not that they have rank, but that they don't communicate the rank to you. Like I said earlier about driving a car, imagine playing Gran Turismo and you can't see your speedometer. I mean, you just are able to play at a much more sophisticated, deeper level when you understand what's happening with the rank system and what's going on with the level design. And so, ironically, with this information, the first Gradius is actually pretty good about avoiding Gradius Syndrome, because if you have the information of how you're building the rank early on, what you can do is you can hold off on building rank until you get into a little bit of the later stages. And then when you're at the end of the game, because you're so close, you're going to do everything you can to try to get through to the 1cc. And so because of the rank indicator, and because of the shorter length of Gradius 1, and because of the general lower difficulty of Gradius 1 compared to the rest of the series, ironically, you don't necessarily have to worry about Gradius Syndrome. It doesn't come up nearly as much in the first game, but that's not the case in Gradius 2. In Gradius 2, that whole rank dynamic of the first game is less pronounced, and you're basically just meant to play at max power earlier on. And the level design of especially stages 2, 3, and 4 are much more conducive to being played at max power, especially the ice stage, where that's kind of just a DPS check of like, hey, are you powered up? And yes, during the first 4 stages, it is possible to figure out how to play the checkpoints and all that. But the sharpness of the difficulty of playing them at max power versus trying to recover in them is usually too lopsided, to the point where it is more worthwhile in the first half of Gradius 2 to just reset your run. And that's what I ended up doing during my 1cc. I would say in a nutshell, basically, it isn't an issue with the fact that there are checkpoints or there is a progression system. It's more like a balancing issue, where the game's balance of the power-ups and the rank aren't quite working. And so you create these alternative incentives outside of the system. And so I think what could have been a very simple fix is that the game does not give you as much power-up items early on. You should actually be playing those first 4 stages kind of underpowered. And then by the time you hit stage 4, that's when max power becomes more of the standard. So if they just took out more of the power-up items, I think that would help rebalance the game. Interestingly, I think the developers came up with a mechanic to try to combat this, which is the option thief. I love the idea of having an enemy that erases player progression, something that would be considered criminal in modern game design now, but I think something that's very much needed. And the option thief could have been a solution to Gradius Syndrome, because that way you would be constantly having to deal with losing power-ups during the first 4 stages, so that if you died during that time, it wouldn't feel as sharp of a contrast, because you'd have the option thief continually battering away at your power-up level anyway. But unfortunately, there's some basic balancing problems that don't make this happen. First off, the option thief doesn't start showing up that much until the second half of the game. And then on top of that, his function of taking away all of your options if he scores a direct hit, that functions way too similarly to a death. And the fact that he's so manipulatable and you can kind of route out his appearances and even sort of ward him off. What I would do is I'd have the option thief's behavior appear much earlier in the game. I'd have him be much more frequent and a bit more random RNG based. You'd have to react to him. But to offset that, if he scored a hit on you, he wouldn't just take everything, because you might as well just die, right? Instead, if he scored a hit on you, he'd just take one option, but thered be more of him that you'd have to deal with. I think that would really help combat Gradius Syndrome, because you would just be more systematically dealing with losing power regularly, so that deaths didn't feel as sharp. And also, the first 4 stages would feel more variable and fun. So the concept of the option thief, great idea, but the execution doesn't work. And one final note on Gradius Syndrome as a whole, I think it's interesting to point out that for better or worse, the developers of Gradius must have recognized this dynamic, because Gradius is one of the few arcade shmup series that does not allow credit feeding, at least on the original Japanese cabinets. And even if you go into the dip switches, you cannot allow continues. It's just not a part of the game's design. And so I think that actually makes it hold up really well in terms of today's context, because at the very least, you can't get around the design of the game with credit spam. One of the more subtle strengths of Gradius is the way the level design and enemies constantly threaten the player. You're like this plump, delicate balloon trying to fly your way through a hall of Razorblades. Everything just feels sharp and dangerous, and it's not just the enemies themselves, it's actually the construction of the levels with the terrain of the ceilings and the floor and everything in between, and the way the game pushes you into these death pit style hallways. You always feel like the walls are closing in, and that's fantastic because it solves a lot of problems that current day shmups face, where because we're in these big 16:9 spaces and hitboxes have gotten smaller, there's just so much empty space and ability for the player to maneuver around that the level design struggles to be distinctive or to threaten you. And then in terms of the enemy behavior and patterns, even though they're not the most visually engaging design-wise, the behavior of the enemies I think are more sophisticated than meets the eye, because they are very good about always trying to maneuver to above or below you and get to your soft, vulnerable underbelly. And they're very good about putting themselves in positions to be threats. That's why the option system of the game is so fantastic, because the options aren't just there in terms of firepower. One of their most important functions is to act as a defensive barrier above and below you to prevent your weak spots from being exploited. And I love the way the natural positioning incentives of the options work, where if you want to do maximum damage on an enemy, you need to line the options up, shoot the core and all that. But if you want maximum protection from swarms of enemies, then you fan them out and disperse the fire for coverage. It's one of the most distinctive aspects of Gradius's gameplay, and I think it goes back to the very clever level and enemy design. Let's discuss what I think is the biggest flaw of the Gradius series and how this port really helps improve the experience of playing the games, because I think the biggest flaw with Gradius and a lot of shmups during this era is their poorly communicated hitboxes. If you think Dark Souls is bad, look at the Gradius and the rest of the games in the series are up to. It's absurd how disconnected a lot of these hitboxes are from the actual sprites on screen. Until playing this port with its hitbox viewer, I, for a very long time, did not understand the shape of the Vic Viper's hitbox. Like, what is going on with this thing? And then on top of that, I did not understand how large the basic default shot hitboxes were. So I went through my entire experience of playing Gradius over all of these years thinking that that default pea shooter just had this tiny little hitbox, and I always thought, how are you supposed to play underpowered? How are you supposed to get through these checkpoints with this baby-sized hitbox? But if you look at the hitbox viewer, turns out the default shot has a pretty beefy, meaty hitbox that you can actually use to protect yourself. And so this feature alone, on top of all the other awesome stuff Origins is doing, cements it as the definitive port, because you learn so much more about what's going on with the ability to see the hitboxes. And it also made me realize that over all of these years, one of my main gripes with classically large hitboxes isn't their size, because having a large hitbox in terms of design has some interesting implications in terms of it can make patterns more brutal, it can make things more dangerous, it can add in more consequences. I think that's why the hitbox in SDOJ is a little bit bigger. And so there are a lot of valid design reasons to have bigger hitboxes, but I feel like the principle I'm discovering for myself here is that the bigger the hitbox is, the more I think it is important, at least in a shmup, to communicate it, to tell you, this is it, this is the size, this is what you're working with, because so many of the interactions of playing Gradius over these years is just you're flying along and then you explode and die, and you wonder like, what the hell happened? And it's because you don't know what the hitbox interaction is. With this feature though, I know what it is. So I had almost none of that this time around. I'm flying. If I get hit by something, I know I got hit by it. And the thing is that in general shmup design, do I think you should actually have hitbox viewers at all times? No, the goal should be that the actual sprites and visual communication of the game give you a strong, consistent sense of what the hitboxes are. It doesn't need to be as brute force as a literal hitbox drawn on screen like we see here. But in the case of Gradius and a lot of these classic era shmups, where their hitbox to their sprite disjoint is esoteric at times, I think a tool like this is the perfect solution. And then if you get really familiar with Gradius, you get really familiar with the hitbox interactions, then you can just toggle it right off. Damn you, M2, now you've made me want this everywhere now. Like, I'd love to see this, especially in a Psikyo collection. Imagine you can finally figure out Gunbirds and Sengoku Blades hitboxes. I think that would really open up those games in a very helpful way as well. And so I haven't seen many people commenting on this feature, and it is probably the most revolutionary, awesome thing about this collection. And I think it is what is needed to help a lot of people coming into the Gradius series connect with and understand the game, because now you can see what's happening. You have this fantastic rewind feature. You have 100 save states. Overall, in terms of the port features, M2 Shottriggers are in top form. This is the definitive way to play these games. There's no doubt about it. And then it has the leaderboard system. It has ship filtering in the leaderboards. It has built-in replays, which is really useful, by the way, for a lot of the Gradius games, because some of the replays are like 8 loops or some crazy things like that, which are kind of hard to track down on YouTube. So being able to access them, I use that for study. And if you go look into the extras, especially on Gradius 3, the amount of detail with configuring the game and what M2 are aware of is insane. You can tell they are diehard Gradius fans, even outside of just porting the game. And in terms of all the different versions and variations and stuff like that, I don't think their inclusion is necessarily that important in terms of having that be viable content that you're going to play. Are you really going to be playing much of the prototype version of Gradius or stuff like that? But I think they're very important inclusions in terms of game preservation. And I think M2 know that. And that's one of my favorite things about the Shottriggers team. They're not just trying to sell these games to a mass market. They're trying to preserve them into a format that will persist into the future. In case you're wanting to study the development of Gradius, in case you're wanting to study the design of the games. So I think it's fantastic work. M2 are out of control in terms of the quality of their port. So let's talk about the games individually a little bit. Gradius 1. It's crazy how well developed this game is, considering how early it appears in video game history. The game that Gradius 1 is building off of and reacting to is Namco's Xevious, and it's quite a leap forward, I think, in terms of just overall polish and design. I think it's fair to say that Gradius 1 is very much like the Street Fighter 2 of shmups, where a lot of stuff that are still standards and that are really core to the identity of the genre, you can find them in Gradius. For example, the option system that introduces. Options are massive, even now. Death Smiles, a bullet hell, and then of course the power-up system. I don't think we've seen much of an improvement over the Gradius power-up system, other than maybe some variations within later Gradius games. It's just so elegant and well done that I don't think the influence of Gradius can be overstated, and so it is a landmark game. It's a must-play title. It still has teeth all these years later. When I got the collection, I was figuring, I'll knock out a Gradius 1cc in like a few tries. Nope. Even despite all my years of playing shmups and bullet hell, Gradius got some tricks up its sleeves. And it's funny because the boss design of Gradius is clearly its weak point. And so you have kind of an inversion from the Toho style of gameplay, where in Toho, the stages are a formality and the bosses are the key content. Gradius is like the reverse. The stages are the key content and the boss fights at the end, they're a little formality, a bit of a breather, especially the final boss, which isn't even a fight at all. From what I understand, that's actually due to just pure time constraints development-wise. Though this non-boss, final boss has been a trend in gaming. But anyway, it did end up being kind of a trope later in the Gradius series, because going on to Gradius 2, I think Gradius 2 is the platonic ideal of a sequel in terms of design. It builds on everything that was successful in Gradius, besides a little bit of issues with the balance of the ranking system in the earlier stages, which I discussed. Other than that, it builds on Gradius beautifully. It ramps it up. The intro stage is iconic. I love the Gradius 2 intro stage, and I think the developers loved it as well because they kind of leave it running for a bit too long. But this whole concept of the looping scroll with the suns and then the fire dragons come out, it's iconic. And Gradius 2 actually now has boss fights. They're not that crazy. They're still pretty simple and static, except when you finally get to that last boss rush. Some of those are pretty interesting and fun, so the game is getting the idea for boss fights, and then the final boss thing is kind of interesting. Not the helpless face, but the actual invincible robot that you have to go in between its legs and stuff. That's not a traditional fight, but it did kill a number of my 1cc attempts, so it is effective as a climax. Gradius 2, at least among the games in this collection, I think is the most balanced, representative version of Gradius. It's kind of like the platonic ideal of what a Gradius game is. And then from there, we go to Gradius 3, the most famous Gradius game, I think. It tends to be the most popular one, the one talked about the most. And I would say that's because it's maximum Gradius. Jamers, when I was talking to him, described it as expert mode Gradius. This game does not mess around, and it goes kind of crazy with the player progression stuff, where not only do you have a ton of different sets of weapons now, but you have like this edit mode where you can create your own weapon set. And then on top of that, it added in another notch in the power-up bar, which is the anti-power-up. And the reason why that exists is because hilariously, sometimes in the earlier Gradius games, maybe you will overpower yourself with speed, and that can be kind of self-inflicted death trap. And so the final notch in the Gradius 3 bar is to like undo power-ups. So yeah, it's getting meta on its own progression system. Very interesting. In terms of the level design, the game is crazy. In some ways that are good, in some ways I don't think quite hold up super well. For example, it's an hour long. There's a lot of stages that just go on. And this isn't some kind of oversight. I think this is some sort of statement from Konami. It's like the Finnegan's Wake of shmups or something. It's kind of pushing things to the level of absurdity, like the famous Cube Rush, but it seems to be the intention of the developer. It's an artistic statement of game design. Gradius 3 isn't a game. Gradius 3 is a lifestyle, and I'm not quite talented enough as a player to fully do it justice, but yeah, you could just buy this collection for Gradius 3 and I think it would be valid. That game is crazy. And so then we've got the Life Force and Salamander games. I'll admit I'm not as interested in Life Force and Salamander. I just don't think the vertical stages grab me that well. They're not bad or anything. I just think some of the magic of the Konami enemy design and level design is lost in translation. It doesn't quite work as well in the vertical format, at least as it's presented, though I will say they are certainly better than the stupid Mode 7 stages in Gradius 3. Those could just be cut. Though I have played a good amount of Salamander 2, and I think Salamander 2 is really excellent, and it is quite a bit of a different experience from Gradius because of the difference in the power-up system and the difference in the recovery system. And so if you're finding that you want a Konami-style level design, but you don't want to deal with the checkpoints or you don't want to deal with the power-up bar, Salamander 2 is for you, and it is a very well-made, engaging game. And that brings us to the new addition to the series, according to this collection, Salamander 3 by M2 themselves. Alrighty, I want to start this section by reiterating that I'm a huge fan of M2. I love the Shottriggers team. They're kind of my favorite developer working right now. The quality of their ports, as we're seeing here in the collection, is unrivaled. But looking at Salamander 3, first off, I don't think it should have been called Salamander 3 unless you're going to go full force development like Treasure did with Gradius 5. But Salamander 3 feels extremely rushed, and judging from what I've heard from developer interviews, they put it in because they couldn't get Gradius 4 to work in time, and so they thought they should add in an extra game. And I think if you look at Salamander 3 as a bonus extra, just like the Haunted Castle Revisited in the Dominus collection, then I think it's perfectly fun and fine to have as a bonus. But it's way too light and casual to have the title of Salamander 3, and especially if you look at the page or the advertisements and you're like, oh, Salamander 3, I thought maybe that was actually a game that I missed at some point, right? I think they should have called it Salamander Revisited or Salamander Rebirth, just to signify this is a spin-off title. I think that would work a lot better because this game is crazy easy. If you beat it on your first attempt as an experienced player, I wouldn't be surprised. It took me a time or two, but I don't think the balance is really all that strong either in terms of the difficulty. It's basically more of a battle with visibility than the enemy design. Like, a lot of my deaths early in the game straight up came from visibility issues with the backgrounds. For example, in stage 1, that brain, I just ran straight into it because I thought it was a background element. And then with the asteroids in stage 2, the way that they are colored, at least some of them, look like they should be background elements. They have that kind of washed out look, but they're actually foreground objects that kind of just drift into the screen. There's almost an optical illusion element to them at times when they got the scrolling background and then they're kind of moving along with it. It's kind of hard to tell where they are in space. I just do not think this release was polished and finely developed. I think it was just a fun extra they wanted to include. And by that metric, I think it's perfectly fine. But a lot of their balance choices I didn't like either. Like the fact that the first loop is clearly an enforced easy mode, and that if you want to get to a more normal amount of difficulty, you need to enter the second or third loop. And the level design and power-up system ends up feeling pretty static. And one of the biggest difficulty points of the power-up system, I'm not kidding, is deciphering what the symbols are for the various power-ups. Because in Salamander 2, they have text on them to let you know this is what the power-up is. Where in Salamander 3, they have little like glyphs that you have to solve what they are. And yeah, you have a little key in the corner of the display, but I think it's a step back visually in communicating the power-up system from Salamander 2. It's so funny because as developers and fans of Gradius, it's really obvious that M2 know what they're doing and they know how to improve the gameplay experience of playing the classic games that they study so much. But when it comes to creating their own games, they have kind of these blind spots. And that's not surprising because composition and development and porting are two different skill sets, just like being a critic and being a developer are two different skill sets. So I feel a sense of kinship and empathy for the M2 guys with this Salamander 3. It's not bad or anything, but it's just not that great either. It doesn't hold down the collection in terms of, oh, you got to buy it for Salamander 3. But the part about Salamander 3 I find the most disappointing isn't the game design itself, because I think M2 are trying their best with the experience that they have and the time that they have. But the fact of its porting features being so bare minimum is insane. I don't even understand this, okay? So M2, they may not be the game design masters, but they are the porting masters. They are the gold standard for features that they've extended to all of the other games in the collection. But when it comes to their own game, it's like the ugly stepchild that they ignore, where it doesn't have a replay system, it doesn't have a practice mode, it doesn't have the hitbox display, which, trust me, that would be very useful. It doesn't have save states or rewind, and I understand that to some degree because it's not emulated. But because it doesn't have save states or rewind, it definitely needs that practice mode. And then if you want to get to the stage select, there is one, you need to 1cc the game first. Why are you forcing me to play through this mandatory easy loop to unlock kind of the real game? Just make a separate easy mode and then have the second loop be the normal mode. And then with the stage select, yes, it has this cute little interface, but it doesn't have like selecting your power-ups. It doesn't have anything. You have to open the stage select and then input the Konami code to power up properly. Why, M2? This is so unlike you. It feels like some other person just shoved this into the file alongside everything else. It's so weird. I guess we have to wait someday for M2 to port their own game in order to get the features that we normally get from them. Very strange. Maybe they'll patch this stuff in. Maybe they'll update it. That is a possibility. But it does stand out in a lot of ways in terms of just the care and attention it got. And on top of that, it even has some input lag issues. I did a quick virtual stick test with VSync forced off, and the rest of the collection is about 2 frames, and Salamander 3 is 4, and you definitely feel it when you play. And it turns out a Japanese player also did input lag tests and got the same result as well. So that's strange, and I'm not sure why this would have extra lag, other than, like I said, it adds to the feeling that this is just some external game that was shoved into the collection rather than being a natural part of it. And so, final thoughts on the Gradius Origin Collection. I mean, it's such an obvious slam dunk. Do I even have to go through the formality of recommending it? Yes, absolutely. This is a must-buy collection. It's like water in a desert in terms of this year's releases. Of course you have to get it. It's just everything you could want in terms of giving these games the care and attention they deserve. And I wouldn't worry too much about Salamander 3, honestly. Just view it as a little bit of a bonus, because you've got plenty of meat with the mainline titles. And this is essential shmup reading. Gradius is, I think, the most important, significant horizontal shmup series, and it's just one of the most important series in the genre. It's definitely worth the $40. There's no doubt about that. Though I will say, I wish there was a way to kind of give more affordable sample to people who maybe want to try the series out, but they're not quite sure. Because the $40 in terms of absolute value, not an issue, but that overhead cost for someone just coming into the genre who's just a little curious, that is a tough sell still. So I wish they did something like the Capcom Stadium, where maybe they won't break it all the way up into individual purchases, because I do understand that they have more economic power bundled together. But I wish they at least broke out Gradius 1 as a little sampler for like $5, because if you're a Gradius die-hardened fan, you're gonna have to buy the full collection to get at least 2 and 3. But Gradius 1, I think, is a great introduction to the series. And so having that be something people can pick up for a low cost of entry and try out and get hooked on, and then that will more likely bring them towards the rest of the games and the insanity of Gradius 3 and shit like that. So Gradius Origins, my favorite release of the year so far, no surprise, and I can't recommend it enough. And so if you enjoyed this review, definitely check out my video about Under Defeat. That was another killer shmup release and something I still recommend to people. And if you can, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. I'm a full-time YouTuber, so if you can support me on Patreon, that would be fantastic. The patrons are what make the channel happen in a real economic way. And I've got some really cool bonus content on the Patreon that I think you all will enjoy. And this month's, I think, is going to be pretty interesting. I'm going to be talking about the dangers of psychology-based design, which will tie into some of the stuff I talked about in the beginning of the video. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Absconditis, Eternal Solitude, Handhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Aldurin, Alex Kors, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Harbin Gordon, Arcade Hell, A Royal Guard, Arrow Viper, Ash FL, Au Li, Autonamed, Baron Metzigerstein, Battle Mode, Basil Me Dazzle, Bellator Poeta, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Beetle Dames, Boghog, Borgie22, Boston Crab, Brokeface, Brindale Swiftfoam, Brodequin the Lonely Poet, Bruh, Bohem, Captain Rhodes, Captain Shrimp, Catchright Studio, Cat and Crack, Cha, Chad Goulding, Chamor Decluet, J-Flip, Kristen Socal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipollino 0404, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claircliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, CMD, Coast, Concreted, Cooksand 666, Cook Some Soup, Corio, Corn Hoglin, Cozy, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Kudo, CZR, Des Audio, DRK, Damian Thorne, Dan Matai, Danchi, Darren Griffin, That Guy, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dididum, Demian Smirnov, Duram, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Dio Domke, DJ 420 Praise It, Don Pedro, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Drayton Barrett Rathun, Duckies, Easter Egg, Eduardo Oquinta, Edvard, Elbin Senisev, Elias Alonso, Empty Disco, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lizama, Evan Serafet, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Falcus, Benich Mathai, Firez, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Gabriel Forner, Game Soup, Game Boy Gru, Gelhoff, Gettershine, Gojira Green, GPM, Hawk, Hamadawama, Hans Kowalski, HDZ 274, Hero Death, Hamas Hardhat, Han Harthy, HUD, Humongous, HW Folder, Iran DMS, JDab, Jurgen, Jack Walsh, Jacob Foley, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, James Mosca, Jason, J McCarthy, J67, JLab, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, JMD, Joey Jojo Joestar, JOH, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slayleyes, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, K, K2, Kane Evans, K-O-Tune, Ken10082, Kill All Music, King Joker, Kinstro, Contain, Praise the Boys, Kumawamu, Kumama, Kyarts, Kyrol, Leonard McCoy, Loberta, Lobos, Luna Lilich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Mark Mann, Mason Polar, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Matau Batau, Maz, Makaroka, Minong, Meister, Men's Raya 96, Metal Slime Drummer, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZDM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morag, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Musashi, Miles P, Mishkin, Naps91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Neon Ninja, Nervous J, Neuroshima, Nicholas Reichman, Nikki Negative, Nilfheim, Neo04, Okla Kugels, Oleg Talmasev, Panther Dragoon should have been arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Howell Parole, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, Pizza Belly, Platinum Mad, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Psychovania, Queen Charlene, Quilon Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Raccoons, Raphael Trujillo, Randoom, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Halt's Time, Repo Man, Retrojet, Retro Man, Retro Schmupper, Richter, Riff Mason, Robert Chang, Roop Olander, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Running Aku, Salmon Connections, San Evo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Segfault, Senpai Please, Cyril XP Greg, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shitsu Supreme, Shinjutsu 1600, Shiny, Shmup Junkie, True, Simply Chrono, Sirapong, Skater to Employ, Social Kid, Sophisticated, Space, Spagward, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Ted Ray 77, The Dirty Screech, The Kachow, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, T Money, Tofu Man, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, 2YU, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Typoair, Urokeeper, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vandal, Velenix, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vincetti Brincy, Wizard 16, Vlad STG, Wabbylegs, What Is This? William Miller, William Wallace, Yakiback, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yeastbird, Zachary Patton, Zach Zenryoku, Zingus, Zerolux, Zorpnods.